Good afternoon, colleagues, friends, and dear students. It is my great pleasure to welcome Professor John Minford on behalf of the Hong Kong Translation Society. Many of us have been inspired by Professor Minford's exceptional work, particularly his co-translation of The Story of the Stone with Professor David Hawes. It is widely regarded as one of the most masterful translations of Chinese literature in English. My personal encounter with Professor Minford came through the Translation Oral History project of the Hong Kong Translation Society, while I had the pleasure of producing, together with Dr. L.Z. Chen, his interview video and learning about his love for translation. Originally, we had hoped to invite him to Hong Kong for the project so that he could join us for the project video launch last year. But unfortunately, due to a time clash, we were unable to do that. So today we're really very, very happy that he's here with us. I would also like to remind everyone that today's event is interpreted by alumni and current students of the Department of Translation, Interpreting and Intercultural Studies at Hong Kong Baptist University. If you require interpreting services, please obtain a simultaneous interpreting set with the help of our staff. 我想提一提大家，我哋今日嘅活動咧，其實係有廣東話嘅即時轉譯嘅。咁如果大家有需要嘅話，可以揾個工作人員拎一些轉譯嘅機。We are committed to ensuring that everyone can fully participate in this event, regardless of language barriers. Thank you for your attention. Without further ado, I'd like to invite Professor Stuart Christie, Executive Associate Dean of the Faculty of Arts of Hong Kong Baptist University, to share a few words of welcome on behalf of the university.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Professor John Minford, Miss Jamie Hedahens, colleagues, students, and friends. It is my great privilege to speak a few words this evening in respect of Professor John Minford, whom I've only just met, the distinguished translator and guest of the Hong Kong Translation Society. And I must confess to being somewhat in awe, I hope not crassly, of my subject. A modest man by temperament, Professor Minford will not, I trust, feel too sheepish or awkward when I declare, and entirely without your permission, that in my view, Professor Minford's living legacy and life work have established cardinal points for East Asian area studies, and not exclusively translation studies alone. Joining London, Canberra, Hong Kong, Beijing, in the same shimmering constellation of human knowledge is found, created, translated. Out of deference to my guest modesty, I'll try to tone down the rhetoric a bit. Still, even a non-specialist as I am can well appreciate that Professor Minford descends from a very fine tradition of British-born scholars and thinkers who chose, after having received a quality education, to stretch their legs and unfurl their wings when scaling beyond that outsized yet insular isle, its language and traditions, so crucial to modern global history, and at least arguably South and East Asian modern history and languages in particular. In this, Minford is perhaps not unlike his fellow old Wickhamist of a prior generation, and someone of whom I admire greatly, Professor William Empson, who, as the leading literary critic of his own day, also knew our Hong Kong shores and cherished the experiences of other Chinese spaces prior to and after the Second World War. Or again, another product of Winchester, the late Jonathan Spence, a historian of modern China who achieved a different space, register, and reach within the history of China and sinology via the American Academy. Or still again, our own cherished colleague, Professor Mark Shuttleworth, the head of the HKBU Translation Department, who descends of a similar tradition, seeking of an international outlet, although in Mark's case, it was initially Russian, and Slavic languages that suited him. This is indeed a very fine lineage and company to keep. Please allow me once again to return more modestly to earth, with the common reader in view. It may be said that long before a foreigner achieves any degree of mastery in the Chinese language, or over one particular aspect of Chinese history across its longue durée, he or she must develop the student's enthusiasm first for China, in scare quotes. This imagined China is abstract, unrooted, and most certainly an undisciplined concept, fed by inspiring images and unfamiliar values. This is precisely how quality translations of Chinese classics into English, such as Professor Minford's, have served generations of readers so capably across the years. His translations have afforded the spark and excitement of an initial and rich encounter, its pleasures and vexations, resulting in an abiding, indeed overriding impulse to continue on with study at progressively more challenging yet rewarding steps. The sheer scope and magnitude of The Dream of the Red Chamber, for example, may well and probably should seem daunting initially. It takes a very special kind of reader who will want to place it on the bedside table and read it cover to cover. Even so, the reading of just a chapter or two of Hobbes and Minford, or even a randomly sampled passage, and you'll get a feeling for the Chinese subject straight away, at once finely crafted, yet also accessible, as all great literature, all great translations should be. One also appreciates the collegiality and collaborative aspect of the exercise. My distinguished colleagues in translation studies here at HKBU this early evening, among them Professor Mark Shuttleworth and Dr. Janice Panjun, who has made everything possible this evening. Janice, thank you. They are always quick to remind me, and rightly, that any romantic imaginings of the translator's solitary toil, while sometimes credible, more often lose out to the collaborative energies of mentor and student, the monk's scriptorium, and all of the group work and necessary give and take among members of the guild, whose collective force achieves greater scale and impact than one can ever achieve. In closing, dear guests, please allow me again to recognize Professor John Minford, returned home to us in Hong Kong after some years away. And in the name of the themes touched upon only briefly by me here, a British foundation in learning, an unfurling arc that made China knowable and meaningful in English to the delight of the common reader whose universe was enlarged thereby, and collective translational energy as a professional practice. Allow me to bid Professor Minford welcome, to wish him, to wish you, only pleasant and fine company for the duration of your stay, sufficient rest, quality cuisine, to the purpose of sustaining a steady gait, keen eye, so as to take all of this in enjoyably, to be uplifted. Welcome, Professor Minford.
Thank you very much, Professor Christie. Now I'd like to invite Professor Mugshot, Head of the Department of Translation, Interpreting and Intercultural Studies, to deliver his welcome remarks. Professor Shuttleworth, please.
What a very special occasion this is, and it's a great honour and a great privilege to be welcoming Professor John Minford this evening, and or other distinguished guests, and a warm welcome to everybody who's travelled here to hear what Professor Minford has to say. We've had the chance to read some of the details of his very distinguished career in the poster that's been widely disseminated. Suffice it to say, having been at school in a certain institution in the south of England, which Professor Christie has already mentioned, he took a first-class honours degree in Chinese literature from Oxford, and since that time has pursued the most distinguished of academic and translation careers in a number of countries around the world. He's held posts in mainland China, in Hong Kong, in Australia, and in New Zealand. And as a translator, he has been most prolific. Amongst his many translations are at least 4 works of classical Chinese literature, any one of which I think could quite justifiably have taken up a whole career to do justice to. There is no sign, obviously, of rushing or superficial work in any case. I myself can bear witness to the quality and the pleasure of reading the translation of Story of the Stone, for a large part of which Professor Minford was responsible. Much has been said and will continue to be said about the recently appearing artificial intelligence tools, and there's been a lot of talk about what's going to happen in terms of the translator's work. Well, I can say that the kind of translation work done by Professor Minford, expert, erudite, thorough, informed, nuanced, will be the last bastion to stand against the onslaught of such tools. I'm greatly looking forward to what you have to say, and I'm sure everyone else is. So I think I've said quite enough. So please join me once again in welcoming Professor Minford.
So may I, before we start, since we are going to have a dialogue later, I would like to invite Professor Christie, Professor Mugshot, and all colleagues of the translation department, and all colleagues of the Hong Kong Translation Society to come to stage, including my students from the translation workshop who helped to co-organize today's event. Could you please all come to stage so that we can take a group photo with Professor Minford? And I'd like to also invite Dora, Reiqi, and to join us for the photo. Maria.
Can you please?
Wow. 1, 2, 3. Oh, okay.
Thank you, thank you. One more with the audience. I think here is. So we were going to take a group photo. We would like to take a group photo from this direction as well. So everybody please get ready and smile. So Minford, if you look at the camera from here. Yes.
Ready. 1, 2, 3. One more. 1, 2, 3.
Thank you very much. Now I feel very, very honored now to give the floor back to Professor Minford. Thank you very much.
No, nothing at all. Can you switch me on? Turn me on? Not working?
Wait, 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3.
如果要聽詞語嘅廣東話嘅詞語嘅話，麻煩問Dora and Rich 佢哋會俾有俾大家聽翻詞語。
Well, first of all, I should thank Janice and Elsie and the people from the Translation Society for being so kind and so come and give this talk. Hello? Is that better? Okay, sure. Yes, thank you, Janice and Elsie, people from the Translation Society, an organisation I've been associated with over 60 years or so, a very long time. And I think it's wonderful. When I first came to Hong Kong, the Translation Society was a very exclusive dining shop, basically. We went to lunch at the Ambassador Hotel at Kowloon, which I think belonged to T.C. Lai, I'm not sure. But my dear friend T.C. Lai, who unfortunately passed away last year, was a wonderful translator and lover of good food, and I think the two go very well together. And I must thank the two gentlemen who spoke so kindly beforehand. I mean, really purple prose. I mean, I had to take a deep breath. That was wonderful of you. And then, of course, what's happening? Extraordinary thing, because somehow the subject of Winchester College comes up, my old school, and also Mark's school. And of course, I was terrified you were going to mention some other people who went there, like Lord Alfred Douglas, you know, Bosie, Oscar Wilde's boyfriend,
Oswald Mosley,
who translated Salome into, into French or into, and Sir Edmund Trelawney Backhouse, the utterly appalling old man who pretended to translate things and had a love affair with the Dowager Empress, and also Verlaine and Rimbaud. And then, of course, we've got Scott Moncrief, who translated Proust. All of these people went to Winchester, my school, and Mark's school as well. And so, anyway, luckily you didn't mention it, so I can mention them too. Anyway, look, you're all going to be very disappointed today because I don't really have anything to say. And I even got the Chinese translation of my talk wrong, but actually I didn't get it wrong, I just changed it. Because originally it was, Qu Jing Tong Yo, and then Yi Jia Zhi Yan, the words of a translator. But actually, without thinking, I changed it to one person's thoughts, and the old expression Yi Jia Yan, of somebody's sort of personal whims, if you like. Everybody's entitled to have their own view. I certainly have my own view, and that's really, so actually my translation is probably more along my lines than the original one. I've been reminded by a friend just recently that I really must stick to the subject of translation, otherwise I'm a complete fraud. But I'm really going to talk about my life, and in a sense my life is what it is, because my translations are what they are, and they have many faults, because my life has been what it has been. And now that I'm nearly 77, I think I'm entitled to kind of look back and, you know, tell stories. I've done that all my life anyway. And the publisher wants me to do my autobiography. So I'm not going to be in a hurry to do it because I still have some living to do. And but I think this talk has given me an opportunity to think a bit and look back and remember a few things. And maybe it all adds up to something. I'm not sure. It might add up to something. It may perhaps tell the story of how I ended up becoming a translator, and maybe how my translations are a bit strange and different and personal. Because I think they are. I mean, I think I started doing it my way, as Frank Sinatra would say, quite a long time ago, because I couldn't do it anybody else's way. And I never believed in translation theory. I'm in fact a well-known enemy of translation theory. I was always in Hong Kong being made to stand up and attack the theorists, from Eugene Nida, Newmar, all of them. I was always propped up like a kind of, you know, puppet to say bad things about translation theory. So I've become a bit notorious. And I haven't changed my views on that at all either. I think it's a complete waste of time, a great method of promoting one's career, but I mean, it doesn't help translators or students. And, you know, I would say, throw away all your theory books, jetez les grammaires. I mean, throw them all away and read a good novel by John le Carré rather than read another Newmark piece of, you know, whatever. Anyway, so there won't be any theory in my talk. And I hope, can everybody hear me all right? Yes. And what about the people? I think it's being interpreted. That's probably the most interesting part. So I called it a garden of winding paths. That was my title. I mean, that is the name of my garden. And if I can get this to work, it's just not really working. I'm always told by these things. I press that and nothing happens. The winding path is a little bit too winding. It's going backwards, but not going backwards fast. Are we there now? Oh, there we go. No, it's still not really. No, it's still not really. Okay, now that's fine. Okay. All right. Well, we don't need that. Now, the key word is the word chu, meaning winding, you see. That word chu actually has two pronunciations. One is chu, meaning wind, and the other is chu, third term, meaning a song. No, is that better? I'm almost going to put this thing in my mouth. Not that I scream, I'm sorry. I find this quite embarrassing. Okay, well, I'll hold it right up against my mouth. So the key word is chu, right? And chu can be pronounced in the first tone, and it means, you know, winding or crooked or curved or whatever. And then it can also be pronounced in the third tone, chu, meaning, you know, san chu or yuan chu, or, you know, a kind of song, a lyrical work to be set to music, indeed to be sung. I'm not going to sing, don't worry, because I've decided to stick with the first term where it means winding. And of course, the first real appearance of this word in a truly philosophical sense is in the great Tao Te Ching, where it simply says, choose a chance. So, in order to become complete, you need to be winding, you need to be curved, you need to be, as all Taoists are, flexible, unpredictable, fluid, like Bruce Lee, you know, be like water, you know. I'm not going to start getting political, don't worry. But that's the most ancient, really, locus classicus of that word chu, and one that we should do well to remember. And that is the famous expression which says chu jing ping yao, which means a curved path reaches that wonderful state of being called yo, almost impossible to translate. I challenge anyone to translate that word yo. It means, I can't translate it, okay. And the whole idea of this garden of winding paths goes back to a garden in Suzhou, which I visited in 2019, the last time I went to Shanghai. I was lucky to have a day in the wonderful city of Suzhou. I visited several gardens, and finally I said to my host, I really want to visit the Chu. He said, oh, it's not open to the public. I'll give them a call. He gave them a call, and we were able to get in. This is the garden where the grandfather of the great Hmong scholar Yu Pingbo, Yu Yue, he basically created the garden and lived in it. So I really wanted to go there because I've always loved Hong Kong. And then we went there and spent the day actually in a very quiet, there were no tourists because it's close to the public, or it was then, and had a wonderful day in the real Suzhou Quyuan. And this in fact is the word Quyuan in the rather interesting form of calligraphy. I think that's actually Yu Yue's calligraphy. And this is the garden. It's a very small garden, but so nice. So nice that I wrote a whole sort of novella set in this garden. And then when I have been living in New Zealand for a number of years, and during the COVID debacle, I decided to create a garden of my own, and using bamboos and various winding paths. So I thought I'd call it, in fact I was inspired by the Suzhou garden to call it a Xiao Quyuan, my little garden of winding paths. And you can walk up and down it and the paths wind. And at the very end of the garden is a very lovely head of Guan Yin, which I picked up in China in 1981 from a little temple outside Beidai. And this is my little garden of winding paths, of which I'm rather proud. I'm not really a garden designer or anything, but I had a lot of fun making it. And a very dear friend, Australian carver, carved that stone. It's a piece of stone from the South Island of New Zealand, with the words, Fu Sheng Yi Mao, this floating light is a dream, a sentiment with which I totally agree. And next to it is my head of Guan Yin, which I've kept for 40 years, and finally found a place for it. Although now I'm leaving New Zealand, I shall have to take it with me and find another place for it. And that's the garden, using bamboos and winding paths, and there's the head of Guan Yin. So that's basically telling you why I've called my autobiography A Garden of Winding Paths. Also, my life has been a series of winding paths, and right now it's wound its way back to Hong Kong, I'm very pleased to say. And so you'll have to forgive me, my presentation is totally childish and simple, and I will just tell my story. I'm going to begin with my own childhood, because what else can I begin with, And that's me as a very small baby with my black nanny. I think one's allowed to say black in the case of this case, because she was very black. She was from Trinidad, and she was called Ivy. And she looked after me for the first 6 years of my life, which was spent in South America. I grew up in Venezuela and Argentina. So already I'm telling you the story of a very wandering life. I wound my way around the world. I mean, I never settled anywhere really for very long. And my son always says, Dad, you'll never stay anywhere for more than 5 years, I'll bet that. And he's quite right, I'm now leaving New Zealand to go back to Europe. That'll hopefully be the last of my wanderings. And anyway, that's probably the oldest photograph I've got. And there's me in a state of nudity on the beach, with my mother on the right, and my Chilean grandmother Juanita on the left. I think that would have been some English beach. And this is my grandfather, my very dear grandfather, who was descended from a Norman knight who came over with William the Conqueror. Richard de Sales, his name was, and all the first boys in the family were always called Richard. So he's probably Richard Sale the 27th or something. The Americans would put a number up there. And he's a man who, as I grow older, I try to emulate. He was very deaf. He was very humorous, and he was a real EJ. He had his own ideas about everything, and I think he was a very remarkable, wonderful man. He's carrying a very strange bag in that place, by the way. He's not a carpet dealer. He just happens to be on his way somewhere. And there he is again with my brother, and my brother Patrick is a very distinguished academic economist, and we've been very, very close brothers all my life. And he even reads my translation, which I think shows great devotion. And there he is standing next to my grandfather. They were playing croquet, because my grandfather was a very fine sportsman. He played cricket for England. And so I have a lot of athletic people in my family. This is my Chilean grandmother, so I am actually 1/4 Chilean. I have a very mixed, lineage. I mean, I'm by no means purely English at all. And I'm partly Russian, partly Chilean, partly, and in fact, mainly from Northern Ireland. where my ancestors were brought by Oliver Cromwell to massacre the Irish of the 17th century. So I've got a pretty rum background, really. I think it all adds up to a pretty wandering and unwinding life. And this is me at a young age, obviously dedicated to writing, because there I am, pictured with a pen and a piece of paper. Obviously, I was destined to do something on that line, but I could have become an accountant, who knows? And here I am again with my brother Patrick, looking rather plump. I mean, I'm quite surprised sometimes by what a plump little boy I was, but I mean, and in my old age, I think I'm becoming plump again. This tends to happen. Then I started to grow up. Growing up is a very painful process, and you can see from my rather tormented face there that as I grew up, I started to taste the travails of human life. And then I started to get even more grown up and serious, rather penetrating gaze. It's simply a passport photograph. And this is I think, will sum up my childhood. It was here in my parents. My father came back from the war and married, no, he married my mother before going to the war, actually. He's wearing his uniform. And there on the very far left is my maternal grandmother. On the far right is my maternal grandfather. And next to my maternal grandfather is my lovely Chilean granny, Juanita Gutierrez de Macay, and from a very old Chilean lineage. And of all my grandparents, she was probably my favorite. She was a musician and a very wonderfully refined lady. And this is a similar kind of group photo, if you like, which shows me, the little fat boy on the right-hand corner, and my mother holding my baby sister, Sally, who is now a psychic medium. Now, I don't say that just to entertain you. I say it because I think what she does is very, very similar to what I do. She listens for voices, and she goes into a trance, and she communicates with the spirits of the departed, which is exactly what translators do, you know, after all. I'm not going to go into a trance, don't worry. But that's my sister Sally as a tiny baby being christened, and my mother looking, obviously had a new hairdo, and behind my mother, interestingly, is my father's very best friend, Jack Moore. I just mentioned that in passing. And there I am again with my brother looking again. My brother Patrick was a very serious boy, always the serious one, and now he's a very serious economist. And I was never that serious. And there's our friend from the village. And behind us is my grandparents' house. And I'm still trying to grow up in this picture, as you can see. And I think I thought I could become a bit of an aesthete. I sort of worshipped Oscar Wilde and people like that, and went through a rather aesthetic sort of phase. I'm actually in the Philippines wearing a Filipino, Barong Tagalog. I mean, I traveled all the time in my youth, my childhood, and even in my adult life. I've never managed to stop traveling. But I think maybe that is partly behind my peculiar way of translating. I think translators live in parallel worlds. You know, we don't really ever live in one world. And even when you become a sort of habitual translator, you're always thinking about how to translate things. Oh yes, that's a nice phrase used by Henry Kissinger. How would I translate that into Chinese? I mean, it's almost a bad habit, you know. But I think traveling around sort of inculcates that. You start to feel you don't really belong anywhere, and therefore you can belong in several places at once, which is a kind of mental disease, I think. But I mean, it just is the way my life has unfolded. Now, one cannot avoid saying things about one's father, especially in a Chinese context, you know. And my father was a man I had a huge admiration for. He died terribly young. He was 48 years old when he died. And he was a very, very promising diplomat. He worked for the British Foreign Office. So those two photos really capture him in his youth when he first joined the Foreign Office, looking rather slim and slick. And then this is later in his life when he started to really enjoy life. He's on a boat, he's probably had a good glass of wine, and he's enjoying his life. Unfortunately, he died so young that he never really reaped the fruits. He was a very fine sportsman. He played 5 sports for Oxford. He had 5 blues. He was a very fine tennis player. I inherited none of those characteristics. He refused to teach me tennis. He said, "You'll never be any good, John." give up. So he was so good himself that he couldn't waste his time on me. And there he is with some of the board of the Asian Development Bank, because he was on the board of that. And he mixed with some pretty important people, and that gave me an interesting start on international life. Now, enough about my childhood and my parents. Now we move on to the subject of Winchester and the whole business of education, or rather what the French call formation. I like the word formation. I think it's the equivalent of the Chinese word xiuyang. It's more than education. It's how you become a person, how you become it's self-cultivation, really. And here we are, here I am with all my contemporaries at Winchester College, and I'm offering a prize to anyone who can identify me in that photograph. Anyway, I won't actually offer a prize, but I mean, it's quite easy. I'm in the top row, one from the left, and next to me is Nicholas Postgate, who became Professor of Assyriology at Cambridge. And I won't tell you about all of it. There we are wearing those silly medieval gowns, and we had to wear them all the time. And we're being photographed in the cloister of Winchester, in the chantry. And this, of course, is the superb chapel. I'm just showing you a few pictures now of Winchester because it was the most extraordinary place to grow up. I mean, now that I'm nearly 77, I can look back and realize what an extraordinarily lucky person I was to spend my adolescent years at this school. Of course, I should have been out there chasing girls, but I mean, all we had was boys at Winchester, and as Lord Alfred Douglas will no doubt have told you, but I mean, the point is, despite the limitations of that lifestyle, it was the most extraordinary place to grow up in. You could do anything you liked. You could learn to fence, you could learn to do any kind of sport, you could play music, you could do art, you could do pottery, and we lived in this wonderful medieval quadrangle. I mean, and the cloisters, we had a library that was almost as good as an Oxford College library, with some very rare books in it, and a wonderful school crest which says "Manners maketh man," which doesn't mean table manners. It means your mores, your actual kind of. Confucius would absolutely love this one. You become who you are because of the way you live. And this is the later building, which has the classrooms in it, and the main entrance with the statue of the Blessed Virgin Mary above the gate. And this is the street where Jane Austen lived some of her last years. That's an old picture of the chapel. Another one of the library. And this building was actually designed by Sir Christopher Wren. I mean, just imagine having just an old hall just round the corner that happened to be designed by Christopher Wren. And we even had our own kind of football, I mean, people think rugby was the game. Rugby was simply the football played at rugby school. But we had Winchester football. We weren't going to mess around with rugby. We had Winchester football. And what a terrible game it was, too. Always played in thick mud. And, it was going to make men of us. It never made a man out of me. And well, we got more of the chapter. And we also had Winchester College notions. You did, didn't they? Okay. Well, Winchester notions. I mean, I think this is at the root of my entire attitude towards translation, because basically, new boys were given this little book, and it had words that were unique to Winchester. For example, you didn't call a bicycle a bicycle. You call it a bogle. You see, he was at Winchester, right? You call it a bogle, and you didn't call your parents. You call them. Oh, you're in trouble. The prefect will have to give you a good caning afterwards. You call your parents pitch up. And there was a special holiday called hatchstoats, and all echo rolls, and you learned an entire vocabulary. And if you didn't get it sorted out, you had to go to the dormitory. The prefect would stand in front of the fire with his gun flung over his shoulder, and he would question you on your notions. It was terrifying. And little boys would tremble in their pajamas, and so we had to learn a special language, which is kind of what translators have to do. Anyway, there's the little chantry, which was the junior chapel. I used to play the piano for services there. So that's the other recurring theme in my winding path is a love of music. For me, music was always my first choice as a career, but I never really made it. And I think music actually underlies my actual attitude towards translation. I think words have to sing, and even normal prose, even a paragraph in work of fiction like the story of the Seng has to have a rhythm and a melody to it. For me, that is the ultimate criterion. And we did a lot of translating at Winchester, and that's where I first started translating. We had to do unseen translations. This was every week. You'd come into the classroom and you were given a piece of Latin or Greek. That's all we did, Latin and Greek, and a difficult piece. It would be chosen, for its difficulty. You had no dictionaries, and you had to just work it out. You had 1 hour, and you just had to work it out by sheer logic. Is that word? There will be about 10 difficult words. Is that word a tortoise, or an armchair, or a rifle? What is it? And you would get good marks for something that worked, even if it wasn't the real answer. And every week we did that, and it was my kind of baptism into the world of translation. We also had to write poetry in Latin, and I got a gold medal for Latin verse composition, which I'm afraid to say, when I was an Oxford student, I took down to the local jeweler and pawned for £5. So I should have kept the bloody gold medal, but I mean, I have it in my memory, a gold medal. This is one from the reign of Queen Victoria. I haven't got the original of mine. And there's also a wonderful work of art in a sort of corridor by the kitchen of college called The Trusty Servant. And there's a poem with it, which I thought was rather good. I think a translator has to be a trusty servant, a devoted steward towards his master, her master. And in this case, that trusty servant was when I would walk past maybe five or six times a day. A trusty servant's portrait would you see, this emblematic figure will well survey. The porker's snout, the pig's snout, not nice in diet shows. The padlock shut, no secrets he'll disclose. Patient the ass, his master's wrath will bear. Swiftness in errand, the stag's feet declare. And so, in other words, the dedication, the devotion of this servant, quality I think all translators should emulate. We are the servants of our authors and the servants of our readers. And of course, the sheer age of Winchester is something absolutely staggering. I mean, it was founded by William of Wickham, who lived in those years, and it was late Ming, or no, early Ming did it. It was early Ming school, and so that was where everything started for me at Winchester. Left a very, very deep imprint on me. And the older I get, the more I realize that I owe just about everything in my education to Winchester. After that, it was just downhill all the way, And anyway, after Winchester, I went to Oxford and to Balliol College, a very pretentiously intellectual college. And we were able to use the Bodleian Library. And this is where I get to the sort of, quaint part of my story. Because one day, after 2 years at Oxford, I realized I was wasting my time. I mean, my heart was not in it. I was producing plays, I was playing music, I was having fun. But 2 years of that is probably enough. And at the end of 2 years, I thought, right, time to do something serious. So I was outside the Bodleian Library. I think I've got a picture of it here. Yeah, that's Balliol College, founded in 1263. Now that's actually the Yuan dynasty, And this is the library, amazing library. I'm so pleased to be going back to Oxford because I'll be able to go to these wonderful libraries. And that's the new Bodleian. Now, and opposite the new Bodleian is the King's Arms, very important institution for the drinking of quality ales. Anyway, outside the Bodleian, I paused for a moment. I thought, what the hell am I doing at this university? Why am I wasting my time with frivolous things like theatre and music? And I sat down on a little stone wall, and I thought, right, make a sensible decision once in your life, Minford. What do you really care about? And I thought, oh, right, I care about trees. So why don't I study forestry? We were all lovely, the hippie generation. I mean, I was part of that generation. We loved trees. We loved putting our arms around trees, giving them a hug, and before smoking a joint, of course. In this case, we were sitting outside, I was outside the Bodleian, and I thought, right, forestry, I'm going to be a forester, you know. I hadn't even watched, you know, I'm a lumberjack and I'm okay. I just thought I'd be a forester and grow trees. And so I had the book of the Oxford courses, a thick book, no computers in those days, you couldn't go online. So I turned the pages to forestry, a very fine forestry school at Oxford, a very fine department of forestry. I thought, oh wow, look at this. And then I read the first paragraph, prerequisites, A-levels in botany, chemistry, physics, and I did no science at all at school. So that meant I would have to go spend about 2 or 3 years doing A-levels. And so I thought, no, that's no good. But then I kind of took a deep breath and thought, what's going on here? I don't seem capable of making a decision. So then I did something which I think was a bit strange. I just closed my eyes, and I took the book and I just flipped the pages with eyes closed, and I just put my finger on a page, and it said, Honor School of Chinese. That's an interesting one. So the next morning I went to the Chinese department, and I said, all my life I've wanted to study Chinese. Please, will you take me in? And they were so nice. They were a very tiny department. In my year, there were 4 students doing Chinese, 4. And they said, look, they welcomed me with open arms because they had so few students. And that's how I started to learn Chinese in 1966, a very long time ago. And so I suppose that's a very important turning point in my winding path, because having started to learn Chinese, there was really only one way to go, and that was to learn more Chinese, because once you start learning Chinese, you never let go, because it's the most fascinatingly wonderful and beautiful language. The sheer, you know, even one character like the word "chu," you know, every word in the Chinese language is a work of art. It's the product of thousands of years of a very, very highly advanced civilization. And that's what kept me going, you know. So for 2 years, I basically worked very, very hard at learning Chinese characters. And I also went to the King's Arms for a drink in London. So that's it. If I'm trying to tell the story of how I became a translator, which I'm not really trying to do, but I mean, that was a turning point. Because that once you get stuck into the Chinese language, there's really no looking back, unless you just bail out, which a lot of people do. But once you get hooked on it, it really does, it gets a grip on you. It kind of, you become a slave to it. You become a trusty servant. Now, meanwhile, as I said, I've been spending time doing other things. I was very interested in the theatre. And I even when I was at Winchester, I acted the part of Sir Thomas More in A Man for All Seasons. That's me wearing the gown on the left, and the boy on the right playing my daughter was another boy from the school. Because all the boys, we have to get boys to play the girl. So I was really enjoying the theatre, and I put on a play called Marat Sade about the assassination of Jean-Paul Marat. And among the members of the cast was my very dear friend Howard Marks, who later became the world's largest drug dealer, and a biography of him called Mr. Nice was a bestseller. Howard was a delightful person and did the best impersonation of Elvis Presley you've ever heard in your life. And he wanted to join in the play, so he came along, and there he is, singing, no doubt, an Elvis Presley impersonation. And we put on the play in this huge 13th century tithe barn, a magnificent building, and there was a cast of about 35 people, and we ran for about 4 nights, absolutely sold out. And it was a wonderful experience. I really enjoyed directing a play. I should have been a theatre director, really. And I really enjoyed rehearsing dialogue. And for me, that's also part of a translator's job, is to know how to write dialogue. It's very hard to write dialogue, very, very hard. And many years later, I was translating the last part of Hong Ramon, and I came to a dialogue between Jiao Baoyu and Lin Daiyu, those absolutely impossible individuals who could never say to each other, I love you, or give each other a kiss or a cuddle. They were just always playing Zen games, you know. And there was a piece of dialogue which I found very, very hard. And I said to my dear friend Stephen Sung, could you help me with this dialogue? And he was a man who was in the film world, and he went home with this page, And he stayed up all night because his wife called me the next day and said, "What have you done to Stephen? He's been up all night, walking up and down the corridor, trying to speak these lines because he wants to hear the dialogue." And anyway, he came in the morning looking like death and said, "John, I think I know what it means." And then he performed the whole thing like a play. He was absolutely right. He really put me onto the meaning of that piece of dialogue because he saw it theatrically. You know, he saw it as a man of the. His father was a professor of the drama at Peking University. You know, Song Chunfang was a great expert in Western drama, mercilessly parodied by Somerset Maugham. But I mean, Stephen knew how to read dialogue, and he taught me how to understand that passage. I've still got his notes. So the theatre helped. The theatre, he was another part of that production. We also set songs for music and so on. It was terrific fun. And I've always loved the theatre. I love the way. I mean, Oscar Wilde's dialogue is just absolutely brilliant. And I think translating fiction, one of the hardest things about it is in fact the dialogue. Now, I was very, very lucky at Oxford because I stumbled upon a teacher who was probably the greatest scholar of his time in Chinese and the greatest sinologist, I think, of his generation. And David became my teacher, my mentor, my friend, my collaborator, and eventually my father-in-law, reluctantly. And there we are, you know, I'm kneeling, I think, rather appropriately beside him while he looks at something or other. I'm not sure what the book is. But David really, I served as an apprentice, that's what I did. I was his apprentice, he was my master. And I would go and see him, once we got started on the Honorary project in 1970, I would go and visit him every week for a whole morning. Sorry. So really I learned everything from him. I mean, what they call co-trial. He, without really meaning to teach me, he taught me by example. And I would receive all his typescripts and read them. And I learned everything from that. And he never read a single book of translation theory. In fact, he thoroughly despised translation theory, had no time for it at all. And but he just knew how to translate. He was an absolute fanatical translator. I mean, he lived inside the book. He rang a letter saying, "Oh, I bumped into Jia Bayu this morning in the high street," you know, that kind of thing. These people were alive in his mind. He couldn't say goodbye to them. They were always living in his mind. And he taught me that as well, because I also had to live. I had to live out the last 40 chapters, which are full of doom and gloom. Terrible things happen to the Jia family, you know, and to the individuals. And towards the end of his life, I put together with his daughter Rachel, my wife, I put together this tribute to David when he was 80 years old in 2003. And in fact, this year is his 100th anniversary. And I'm very pleased to say that the Chinese University is going to celebrate that with a big exhibition in September, which I'm helping them organize. Now, I've slightly jumped ahead because I'm starting to talk about translating Hong Lao, but actually, how did I get there in the first place? How do these things happen? How do you choose a book to translate? You know, do you do it logically? Do you do it rationally? Do you consult something like that? And in my case, it was a very simple matter. When I started to study Chinese, I was supposed to go and spend a whole term in China. But unfortunately, a certain gentleman by the name of Mao Zedong decided to have a thing called the Cultural Revolution. So I wasn't exactly welcome in China. So I came instead to Hong Kong. And that's the first time I ever came to Hong Kong, was in the autumn of 1966. And I was looking for a place to stay. So I put an advert in a newspaper saying, young Oxford student, I was young, I was 20 years old, young Oxford student willing to teach children English, French, and music in exchange for accommodation. I thought, no one's going to answer my ad, you know. I was sitting in a bar in Wan Chai, actually waiting for a call. And the very next day, I got a call from a family living on Hobanton Hill Road, you know, Hobantian Shandar, a very exclusive apartment block on the very top of Hobanton Hill Road. And they said, come and meet us, we're interested in your advertisement. So I went to meet them, and they were a family of 3, 2 girls and a boy. Albert was the boy, Alice and Rosanna were the 2 girls. And the mother was a real jambu, she was a real matriarch. And she interviewed me through her daughter Alice, who spoke good English. And the result was they hired me as the family tutor, a very traditional Chinese role. You know, I became the family tutor, and they had a penthouse flat above theirs. They were a very wealthy family from Jiangxi province. The father had racehorses, and he ran the racing paper. So suddenly I had a flat of my own with a piano and a balcony looking out over the hills. And I taught these 3 children, and that went on for quite a long time. And then one day at lunchtime, the old lady said to me, she spoke in very, very slow words, because I knew virtually no Chinese. She wrote down on a piece of paper, if you want to understand China, if you want to understand Chinese people, if you want to understand our family, this is the book to read. Hong Yo Ma. Okay. She gave me the piece of paper. I didn't know, I couldn't read Lo, it was much too difficult. And Mung, it was much too difficult. Hong, I could just about get. Anyway, I took this piece of paper back with me to Oxford and said to the 2 teachers who were there, I want to study this book. And I discovered it was on the list of set books for Oxford. They'd actually included it in the list, in the curriculum. So I said, please teach me this book. And they said, no. They both said no. And the 2 teachers were Ian McMorran and Glenn Dudbridge, young, newly recruited lecturers. And they frankly said, we're frightened of this book. It's too dangerous. Don't touch it. You'll never get, it'll never leave you for the rest of your life. I said, well, but why is it on the list then, if I'm not allowed to study it? Well, just believe us. It's a bad book, dangerous book, and we're not going to teach it to you. So I said, well, that's very bad. Anyway, they said, however, the Professor Hawkes, is coming back from his sabbatical. Try him. He's a bit interesting. So when he got back, I went up to David Hawkes and said, will you teach me Hong Yo Ma? And he just looked at me and said, will I? Of course I will. And we sat down. I was the only student, and he taught me the first 10 chapters of Hong Yo Ma. We read it aloud together. And that was how I got involved. And then later on, he, in an extraordinary act of generosity, he invited me to collaborate with him on the complete translation, which began in 1970 and didn't end until 1986. So that's a lot of time to spend on one book. And I only did 40 chapters, he did 80. But it was a really long project, and I learned everything I ever learned from that project, basically. Because when I started, I was just a young student, and it's a very difficult novel, and there were no other translations, and the only translation I was able to get hold of at that time was the Russian one, and I don't read Russian, so I had to really start from scratch and work out what these chapters meant. It was very hard work, and I made a lot of mistakes, and I had to learn the hard way, and that's the only way to learn. Now, I've said that the theatre was very important to me, and I think very helpful in doing dialogue. When I translate dialogue, I always want to hear it, you know, as if it's on the stage, as if I'm directing a play. But also, more important than the theatre to me has always been music. Fundamentally, I'm a failed musician, and you know, I like to play the piano. I've got a few pictures of me playing the piano, which are very embarrassing, so I'll go quickly through. And I once had aspirations to become a pianist, but it didn't work out. So I became a translator, you know, through default, really. And anyway, so I'm all set to do this job, translating the great novel, and you know, struggling and so on and so forth. And then life comes along and deals me a huge body blow. So first of all, it makes me fall in love, and then it takes the love of my life away. She dies very, very young. I'm not going to linger on this, but I can't not mention it, because it was a very profound experience. I was a very young man, and as a result, I became the scholar gypsy. And this was my first wife, a young lady of extraordinary beauty and charm. And unfortunately, in a trip to North Africa in 1973, when she was literally 24 years old. She caught an illness and died, and I had to bury her in a graveyard in Algeria. So that was an experience that really shook me to the absolute core, and of course delayed the translation of Honorary enormously. But it gave me an experience that really I had to be part of my life. I mean, it was my destiny to go through this. And after that, for several years, I was just reeling from the shock of, I had 2 small children, my very young and very beautiful wife had died, and I was really struggling to recover from this. And out of the blue, really, although of course the gentleman himself believed it was predestined, a professor from Australia by the name of Liu Sunren offered me a PhD scholarship to go to Australia. And this is the gentleman concerned, who I think many of you know, because he spent a lot of time in Hong Kong. A very, very fine scholar, one of the last of the great scholars of China. And he sort of literally picked me up like that from a state of poverty and despair, really, and just lifted me up, transported me across the world to go and study for a PhD in Australia with all my family and everything. And he took care of me for the rest of my life, really. I mean, for the rest of his life, I should say, because he died in 2009. And a very, very remarkable man. He not only was a scholar of literature, he was a scholar of religion, of Taoism, Confucianism, and Buddhism. He was a great authority on Chinese medicine. He was a man who practiced Taoist self-cultivation, a man of enormous learning, but also of great warmth and humor, and became my very closest friend. And when I did that book for David, it was Professor Liu who wrote the Chinese inscription at the beginning, where he talks about Shi Xiong, you see, elder brother stone, you see. And he was a great lover of Hong. I couldn't have found a more perfect PhD supervisor. He really guided me during a very difficult time in my life. He was the one who really helped me grow into a new phase of my life, and sat down with me every week. If I had questions about Hong he would answer them. And in his last days, I was back in Canberra, and I was able to repay him a little by going to visit him every week and taking him food and talking to him at great length. And in 2009, when my father-in-law died, when David Hawkes died, I went round to Professor Liu's house, and I said to him, I'm afraid I have some bad news. Professor Hawkes has passed away. And he sank into his chair, and he just said, there's nobody good left in this world, you know. And he died a few weeks later. He literally died a few weeks later. And I gave the funeral oration at his funeral. And it was a huge loss to me in 2009 to lose my very dear professor. I can't say how much I owe to him. You know, in the I Ching, the great I Ching, it often says it profits to see the great man, you know. Well, he was my great man, more than anybody else. He would always know the answer to a question. Doesn't matter what it was. I mean, about Chinese. I mean, he had an encyclopedic knowledge of every aspect of Chinese culture. Amazing man. And I can only pay tribute to him. Now, after I finished my PhD, because I mean I had to do a PhD, you know, I didn't want to, but Professor Liu, absolutely, I said to him, I think I've had a lovely time here, Professor Liu, 3 years, thank you very much. I think I'll go back to England now and be a hippie again. He just said, you will not do that. You will write your PhD, you will come in every day and finish that PhD, or you will regret it for the rest of your life, you know. And I used to go in every day, and he'd put little pieces of paper under my door with quotations from the I Ching, you know, and because he was so sweet. Anyway, and then at the end of my PhD, I couldn't get a job anywhere. Yeah, nobody wanted to employ me. I applied for 5 different jobs. Nobody wanted me. They took one look at me and thought, no, that's not for us. I don't blame them at all. Anyway, so I said to Professor Liu, I can't get a job. Oh, well, he phoned up the embassy, and in about 24 hours, I had a job in China First of all, they wanted me to read the news on Chinese TV or something, and I mean, because he said I had an Oxford accent. I think maybe I did. Anyway, I couldn't get there in time for that job, and then they found me a job in the city of Tianjin. So I ended up going to Tianjin for 2 years. I asked one of my other supervisors, Pierre Rickmans, should I go to Tianjin? He said, it'll be very interesting. And when I got there, it was very interesting. It was a city recovering from the Tangshan earthquake. It was a very, very, there were virtually no foreigners there. I think there were 25 foreigners altogether in a city of several million. But I learned a huge amount, and I think that's another thing that I would say helped me a great deal, was to, against my own wishes, I didn't want to go to China at all. I wanted to be a Taoist, you know. I wanted to live in the bamboo grove, you know. I wanted to be one of the Zhulin Jixian, you know, playing my guqin and smoking dope, basically. That's what I wanted to do. But I mean, I wasn't there. I couldn't do that, you know. So I had to go to China and be a good boy. And I taught translation. What else could I do? I taught translation to the students at the Tianjin Foreign Language Institute. There's the building. The Tianjin Foreign Languages Institute, was in the building that used to be the Jesuit College in Tianjin. It's where the great Catholic father, Tao Te Ching, he lived in this building. And he collected all his Paleolithic, you know, incredible things that he'd gone out collecting in Mongolia. They were still in a building, locked up. All the Shada stuff was still there. And the Jesuit fathers ran that place for about 70 years. And but now it was a foreign languages institute on the Russian model. And I taught classes in, and my young son Luke went to the local primary school. So it was really what I would call total immersion. And I don't think there's any substitute for that. I could have gone on. When I went to China in 1980, and I tried to speak Chinese, they said I sounded just like Zhao Baoyu. I was speaking 18th century Chinese, you know. And eventually I learned to speak a little bit of real Chinese, but more importantly, I learned the smells and the sights and the sounds and the textures of life, you know, of the real China. And it was very, very tough. I tell you, very, very tough. I lost a huge amount of weight in those 2 years because conditions were pretty rough. And going up there in 1980 on the train, that's my little son Daniel walking up and down the train. And it was that. We went on a hard seat in a Yingzuo, and there was an incredible introduction to China. I mean, China in 1980 was nothing like China today at all. It was very, very primitive, to be honest. And the train, they were very friendly on the train, but I mean, it was very rough. And Daniel just thought it was great fun. He ran up and down the train saying hello to everybody, and he all thought they ought to speak English. Of course they didn't. But he learned to speak fluent Chinese. And he became very sort of Chinese. He looks a bit like the last emperor, you know. I think he thought he was the last emperor. And when I was in China, anyway, this is the other thing I always say to my students: when you're translating, you've got to live. You know, you can't just translate. You can't just go down and sit down, open your dictionary, translate. You know, you've got to have some kind of life experience. And when I was in China, it was a very, very interesting time because there was a whole new movement in literature. And I was very fortunate to meet one of the so-called Menglong poets, and called Yang Lian. He became a friend, and I translated his poetry. So I became very involved in the kind of new literature that was coming out. And that was very exciting. And it was part of the process of becoming a translator was translating whatever comes your way. In this case, modern poetry. And basically, it was very easy because they were all imitating T.S. Eliot. So all I had to do was make their poetry sound like T.S. Eliot, which I did quite successfully. It all looked like cheap wasteland stuff, you know. But people thought it was wonderful, you know. Actually, it was just rather cheap. But I mean, I gave up after a while because I thought, waste of time. But I mean, we had a lot of fun. I took this young man to a conference in Germany in 1986. And I won't go into all the details. We had great fun. And we traveled back, also traveling. As I say, my life has been traveling and traveling and traveling down, winding path. We took the Trans-Siberian Railway through Ulaanbaatar, and there we are with my little last Emperor Sung. On the back it says Ulaanbaatar and Moscow. So we travelled on the train through endless Siberian, monotonous landscapes to Moscow, and then got the train to Warsaw and East Berlin. A great adventure, I have to say. The only trouble was they ran out of wine after about 2 days. They promised they had endless supplies of good Georgian red wine, but actually it ran out after 2 days. A terrible situation. Anyway, we got there in the end. After those two years in China, I had the good fortune, although at the time I thought it was a bad fortune, but actually looking back, it was the great good fortune to end up in Hong Kong. And for the next 4 years, I lived in Hong Kong, I worked in Hong Kong, and I worked for the magazine Rendition, Yizong, in Chinese University. First of all, as Stephen Sung's assistant, and then when he retired, I took over from Stephen and edited the magazine. And I think the best job I ever had. I really enjoyed it so much. We had a little workshop of people, including Chen Shanwei, who now is up at the Caritas, and people like that. And we just had a great time, choosing pieces, translating them, fussing, fiddling around, writing to Zhang Ailing about her wretched translation of Hai Shan Hua Liu Chuan, things like that. It was great fun. And at that time, there were some interesting people at Chinese U. I've got some photos. Here's one of me looking very strange in the kind of, with my one from the left. And then next to me on my left is G.C. Lau, who was like the kingpin of Chinese U at the time. And on his left is Stephen Sung. So I was mixing with these incredibly distinguished older scholars, and something must have rubbed off somewhere along the line, because I somehow managed to fake it and be part of their team. I used to go to board meetings of the ICS, the and I sit there with all these old gentlemen feeling really fake, How could I possibly be taking part? Well, I mean, they were very nice. And I eventually became the editor, and I moved into Stephen's office, huge office. And I was enjoying myself. You can see from that photograph, I was having a good time. And here we are with, I was being used as a kind of chauffeur to drive all these old people around campus. And there was the head of ICF, Zheng Dekun, a very famous archaeologist from Cambridge. And there's Professor Liu popping up at the back there, And then next to me is the great Rao Zhongyi. Now, Rao Zhongyi had the office pretty much next to mine, and he would turn up from time to time, and he would emerge from his office with some huge long scroll of paper and about 4 beautiful girls holding it. And he was worshipped more or less like a god, because he could do almost everything. He could paint in about 20 different styles. He could play the guqin. He could calligraphy in every imaginable style. But he was a great show-off. I mean, frankly, he was a terrific exhibitionist. Totally different from Professor Liu. I mean, they were good friends, but Professor Liu was a very modest, self-effacing, sweet man, family man, Rao Zhongyi was an absolute virtuoso show-off. I mean, and he just wanted to go down to the casinos in Macau and have a good time, And we were very good friends. He was a sweet man to me, and very kind. And mainly because he was an old friend of David Hawkes's. They went back way back into the 1960s, And and Rao Zhongyi would send his favourite students to Oxford to be trained by Professor Hawkes, including Wang Xiukit. And Wang Xiukit went from Rao Zhongyi to David Hawkes. That was his kind of through train, and Kenneth Ho, of course. And so he kind of treated me like an old friend for some reason. I have no idea why. I was just this rather strange-looking guy. Anyway, he was very friendly, and we'd have meals together. I seemed to always have my eyes closed for some reason. I don't know why I got my eyes closed. Anyway, he also has his eyes closed sometimes as well. And later on, many years later, when I did my I Ching, he very kindly did this inscription as a frontispiece. I asked him to imitate the one done by Dong Zobin for Richard Wilhelm, and I sent him a photo of Dong Zobin. He knew Dong Zobin way back in the 50s, and he copied it so beautifully. He used the same wording, you see, and then and I treasure that so much. I should have it hanging in my library in New Zealand. And he gave me all sorts of other bits of calligraphy and stuff. I mean, I think Rajuni captures a certain element in the Hong Kong spirit, which is absolutely unique. You know, he's such a showman. You know, he can perform in every genre. You know, he's an extraordinary man. But I was once talking about him with Pierre Rickmans. Pierre Rickmans knew both Rajuni and Liu Zhenren, and we agreed that they were totally different. They couldn't be more different, really. Liu is the kind of mellow, philosophical, kind, self-effacing, and Rajuni is this kind of, you know, as I say, absolute showman, you know. I once asked a very dear friend, Yang Zhonghan, a very elderly Chinese Mongol prince, who I knew very well as a result of Professor Liu. I said, what do you think of Rajuni? I'm not sure I dare have mentioned it. He said, not bad for a self-taught man. You know, Rajuni, everyone's in awe of Rajuni, but Yang Zhonghan just said, not bad for a self-taught man, you know. Anyway, I mean, my journey was just, went through these 4 years in Hong Kong where I was rubbing shoulders with some of the great giants, you know, of Chinese scholarship in Hong Kong. I mean, it just happened. Anyway, I was also teaching, and these are some of my students. That's Philip Sun Shu Yu, and there's the great yes, Simon Chow. There's Simon Chow, Zhou Zhangxiang, and Philip Sun, some of the MA students. Simon Chow, the crazy man of translation studies. You know, whether he's selling yogurt or doing translation, it doesn't matter. He's always crazy, and a very dear friend. And but he looks like he needs to eat some decent food, frankly. And then, of course, this is a lovely photo of Professor Liu with some of his Hong Kong disciples, you see, including, of course, Joseph and Seng and Su Kit. Old Professor Liu looking very quietly happy, you know, because he loves being with his disciples. And we all, those of us who have been touched by Professor Liu's magic, you know, we have something in common, something that can never be taken away, you know. It's a kind of brotherhood, you know. It's a kind of Jianghu thing, you know. I believe in the whole Jianghu philosophy. You know? If you belong in this brotherhood, you'll never lose it. You know? It stays with you all your life. And then, of course, in that time, of course, the other person who really had a very deep effect on me was the poet Yang Bingjun Yesu, you know, and became one of my very dearest friends. And I translated his poetry until today. I mean, he's a poet I did not find boring, unlike Yang Lian, who I found, you know, in the end, repetitive and monotonous and self-promoting. PK was a really great poet. I mean, really great. And I mean, I think it's a terrible cause of shame that Hong Kong literature has been so little valued in the world, you know. They think Hong Kong a little tiny corner of China. What they care about is people like Mo Yan, you know, who got the Nobel Prize for writing overwritten, unedited novels, which frankly are of third-rate quality in my opinion. But PK is a really first-rate poet, and of course also essayist and writer of fiction and he died so young. It was a terrible thing. And coming back to Hong Kong this time, the person I miss most is him. And of course, there are other men. There are so many talented people in the Hong Kong literary family. The darling Zhongling, you know, he always called herself a Taoist nun, you know. I just love that, you know. I mean, what did Taoist nuns say about? We all know what they do about. And Zhongling was absolutely wonderful, great company. She came to Germany as well with Yang Lian, actually. We had a great time together. A very, very fine lady. I mean, still, of course, you know, producing work. And I translated quite a lot of her poems and stories, had great fun with her. Again, the message is translate whatever comes your way, have fun, enjoy it. And if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. If it works, it works, but have fun. If you're not having fun, it will show in the result, you know. People won't enjoy reading it. So I had a great deal of fun. Julie and I had a great deal of fun. Now we come to the elephant in the room. This is the man who I worked with very closely over many years, and well, I'll move very quickly over to you. I could talk about him for about 10 hours, but I mean, I won't. I will, however, talk about this one photograph, because in 1997, shortly after the death of Deng Xiaoping, Bin Yong invited my father-in-law and myself to a meal in the Mandarin in the old French restaurant Pierrot, which is up on the top. And it was one of the most awkward lunches I've ever had in my life, because David, you can see from his face, he was thoroughly miserable, and he found Jin Yong absolutely unbearable, and he thought he was a third-rate writer, and he doesn't like people who've got so much money anyway. And that lunch kind of was a moment which I happened to have caught on a photo, and I could talk about it with later. Anyway, I worked with Jin Yong over many years. We set out as friends. We ended up as enemies. So that's the story. That's the story. But I learned a great deal from that experience, because translators, we are the world's second oldest profession, and we try to please our clients. And I tried to please him, and I failed. Basically, he didn't like my translation. He thought I should translate every word. He said, like the Buddhist sutras, Now, the rest is going to be very quick, because I'm going to be talking about all my very lovely friends from whom I've learned so much about life, translation, everything, And this is my dear friend Edwin Kong, who every time I come to Hong Kong, I must spend more time with him, because he knows about the art of life. He's one of these real Chinese connoisseurs of his pure joie de vivre is something I learned from him last night. I had the most wonderful meal with him. He's a man who knows all about the film world, the world of the media, literature, history, and so on. A real, I suppose you could say he's a dilettante, but he's a wonderful dilettante. And the motto of the dilettante club in the 18th century is my motto as well. Seria ludo. I play with serious things, I play with the Dilettante Club was founded by Joshua Reynolds, a very great painter, and their motto was drink a lot and enjoy serious things. So seria ludo. And I think Edwin is like a very dear friend in France who taught me a great deal about the French love of life. He was a real philosopher, actually Ukrainian. He was a Ukrainian prince who escaped to France and lived in my local village, and he and I would spend hours talking. This is a painter friend of mine, I learned a huge amount from him. This is the very dear friend Tao Jin, who used to be the head of the Chinese University Press, and a very old and dear friend. This is the opera singer, Deng Lanxia. And this is my dear friend who's sitting in the front row. I won't talk about him. And this is dear Rick. These are all my friends who've given me so much, This is Anthony Hugo Fan, one of my very, very most loyal supporters through the years. When people have wanted to put me down, Anthony stood up for me in some very difficult circumstances. And this is the great French translator André Lévy, with whom I spent many, many wonderful days walking in the wetlands near Bordeaux. And the Czech translator Aldrich Krau, who translated everything. Hong Among Jinping there, you meant Liao Zhai, he's done a lot. And he and I were absolute buddies, We'd go to conferences and escape to the bar immediately, and the translation theorists would come and find us and say, you know what you're really doing, and they'd sort of multi-blah, and we'd say, go away, leave us alone, And Andre and Aldrich were like that. They were true translators. And I can't go on, it's getting too late. Very quickly, at one point, and I think this is something I had to do, and not everybody has to do, I decided to throw it all up and go and grow grapes in the south of France. So I did. I had a great time doing that. And I also know a great deal about translations of my three dogs, because they are so amazingly wise. And if you've been translating Liao Zhai, you can well believe that these three dogs are actually the reincarnations of very important people. And now the two of them have died, and only one of them is left. These are my faithful companions and teachers, to whom I owe a great deal. And the place where I live in France is also an environment in which I'm able to gather my thoughts together. And I've done a lot of my translating in my place of time. And that medallion above the front door is the god Mercury, who of course is the god of not only of mischief, but also of communication and translation. And the Mediterranean has given me so much. The sheer colour of the Mediterranean has enlightened me, has enlivened my life. And these are all pictures of my house in France. And My brother Patrick is one of my great teachers. He and I have opposite views about everything, but we never discuss them. We always play music together. And he sings and I accompany him. And we both love drinking wine. And I owe my brother a huge amount. He's been loyal to me all my life. And I'm his black sheep brother who's done everything wrong. He's been the one who's been given an OBE and become very famous. But he's always been so nice to me. I've learned so much. And he reads my translations, which I think is the absolute ultimate sacrifice. And I thought I'd end, with what I think is probably my favorite experience in my whole life. This is with my dear friend, and in 1997, he came to see me. He said, John, a friend of mine, Wesley Ling, she's a fashion designer, a very postmodern avant-garde. She's terribly small, about 4'3", and he said, she and I want to put on an exhibition, a fake fashion exhibition. We're going to dress up our models in ropes and sacks, and we're going to pretend it's a real one, and we're going to put it on in the Hong Kong Visual Arts Centre, and I'm going to write some fake poems, and will you help? Will you translate the poems? And I said, of course, what great idea. So I got a whole bunch of students together, and we translated the poems. There was one called Barbie City, about Hong Kong being a Barbie city. Come on, Ken, let's have fun. I mean, PK was just having a great time, and then at the last minute he said, oh my goodness, we've got no models. We've got no, what can we do? And I said, what about my daughter? She's at the French Lycée. Oh yes, would you ask her? So I said to my daughter, would you like to come and be a model for the day? And she got her friends to come along. We went to the Hong Kong Visual Arts Centre. And the point was, they had persuaded all the top, Chanel, Dior, to come along and do all the makeup and the hairdos, because they thought it was a real fashion show. So all these girls were sitting around having fantastic makeup and perms, and then they put on the ropes and the sacks, and we recited PK's poems. And the journalists had all been invited to a fashion show. They couldn't decide what was going on. They were just absolutely flummoxed because PK and the fashion designer were making fun of them. They were making fun of the fashion world, and the people there simply did not understand at all. But everybody had a good time. And I happened to have some photographs, so I'm going to end with them. This is the girls. They were. That's my daughter with her rope, and there are two of the other girls wearing sacks, and my daughter with one of her best friends with a chain and ropes, and the people were looking on in complete amazement. What's going on here? And I've just done a complete selected poems of PK's. I've included in the revised edition. I've included 12 poems from this exhibition, because I think people should realize that a poet, as well as being a serious poet, can also be a humorous poet, like W.H. Auden was, for example. And a translator should always reserve the right to have fun. Anyway, that's it. Thank you very much.